You know, it's a mad world when there seems to be constantly enough wealth and money for war, but never enough resources for peace. I mean, even if we curtailed military expenditure now, stopped boosting the arms industry, then the type of programme that's necessary to alleviate this humanitarian crisis could be delivered. Because what we need is something akin to the Marshall Plan delivered after World War II, if not more. Because the reality is that we've a crisis that hasn't been seen since those times. Now, I'm delighted that we did provide the naval ships. I'm very happy with the role that they played. I'm sorry that they didn't bring those people to Ireland sooner than now, when we did play a role in rescuing them. Yes. But I do think, and I'm quite happy to take any number of refugees in here, because, as Deputy Wallace said, we are culpable in this humanitarian disaster. So I think in the limited time that we have, really what's more beneficial is to deal with, well, why is this crisis there in the first place? And, you know, like it or not, from the times of the colonial eras, Europe has sailed around the world, pillaging and conquering and coming home to enjoy the spoils. And then when those whose lives have been destroyed seek a better life, have to exit their countries, borders are put up, barriers are put up, and if you like, the lucky ones are the ones who we've seen washed up on beaches or who are being herded into trains in Hungary. The first thing we have to say is the people who end up in Europe are a tiny, tiny fraction of Europe's population and a tiny fraction of the refugee crisis in this world. Almost 60 million people displaced. If they were a nation, they'd be the 24th largest country in the world. And where do these people go? They go to the misnamed developing countries. In other words, the poorest countries take 86% of the world's refugees. The poorest of the poor of those give asylum to 25%. And we have, in relative terms, very small numbers ending up on Europe's doorsteps, and we call it a European crisis. It's a migrant crisis which Europe has played a part in sponsoring to begin with, not least because of our facilitation of the US military machine. It's a fact that the countries which are destabilised, which have the majority of these refugees, are countries which the West has gone into and destabilised. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, all of these countries, some of them poor countries, obviously some of them now absolutely and utterly decimated. We see through the destruction of Libya, the growth of ISIS. Traditionally, actually, Colonel Gaddafi was one of the EU's favourite border policemen, doing a deal with Berlusconi to, in essence, keep refugees out of Europe, and everyone was happy then. We didn't have to see them. But now, of course, in the disintegration of Libya, the issue is very much on the doorstep of Europe. We have to deal with issues like the US bolstering and facilitating the Saudi regime, and the fact that weapons have transferred through this country last year on their way to Saudi Arabia. Are we in danger of our proud record of championing against cluster bombs now that we're going to find out that actually some of those cluster bombs that ended up in Yemen killing children recently passed through Shannon? There's a pretty good chance of it, because the reality is now, done in reports this year, the US is now the world's top exporter of munitions. Many of those munitions have been used against civilians. Last year, weaponry, 200 tonnes of weaponry passed through Shannon on the way to Afghanistan. It's inevitable that some of this ended up in the hands of the Taliban and ISIS, as it did in Iraq, and that came through Shannon. This is a critical issue for us. I mean, we are complicit in this. Last year, 600 permissions for military aircraft, 55,000 troops transiting through Shannon, most of them on their way to the Middle East. With the words of the Americans themselves, which see Ireland and thank Ireland for their steadfast support in permitting US military transits, which backstop US actions in the Gulf region. In other words, that we are responsible too. I don't like some of the media coverage that's gone on, some of the spin whinging about the so-called cost of refugees, about the problem of refugees and migrants. Yes, it is a very big problem, but we are in part responsible for creating it. And while we do need to respond in humanitarian terms, the best thing we can do is stop making them refugees in the first place and stop facilitating the biggest war machine on this planet on a twice-daily basis, landing military aircraft and transiting thousands of troops. It's just not good enough. It is hypocrisy supreme.
Thanks, Deputy.